Hello, Professor Guthrie. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We are so great to have you here with us today. Professor Guthrie, before we get started, can you first tell us a little bit about yourself and your own personal history of engagement with China?
Sure. Thank you for having me, and it's very nice to be here and be talking with you. Just to very quickly go through my personal history. I started studying Chinese. I was an economics major at the University of Chicago in the late 1980s and started studying intensive Chinese. And at some point, I just became captured by China. I fell in love with the language and started to be very focused and fascinated with the economic transformations that were happening there. I took some time off from the University of Chicago and went to live in Taiwan to study more language, and then continued to study, and then went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, and studied organizational and economic sociology. I became a professor in 1997 at New York University, and at the time I was a professor of sociology, but spent most of my time as a China scholar. And then from there, I moved into the business school world and did a lot of consulting and executive education. I was at the NYU Stern School of Business for several years and ran our executive education business there. And then I was the dean of a business school at the George Washington University School of Business. And then after stepping down from that job, I got a call from Apple, and I went to Apple to help them with leadership development in China, where I was the lead Apple University faculty member for Apple in China. And during that time, I also spent a lot of time just analyzing what the company was doing in China, and how to think about economic reforms in China and in the new era. And then left that job in 2019 and came back, and then joined the Thunderbird School of Global Management, where I'm a professor of global leadership and the director of China initiatives.
I see. So that's a very long and rich experience on China. So, you wrote lots of great books on China and China's business scene, but I wanted to start with your seminal book, Dragon in Three-Piece Suits, in which you study the business scene in the 1980s and 1990s in China, when domestic firms were trying hard to imitate their foreign peers and trying to, incorporate international institutions and norms. And in that book, you argued that your findings support the notion that delinking of trade from human rights is correct, and that economic engagement led to meaningful and constructive reform. So today, it seems like we are finding ourselves in very different circumstances. And, there's a general bipartisan consensus in DC that China's trade practice, suppression of freedoms, and advocacy of authoritarian regimes require a new and less engaging approach. So looking back, do you think the engagement approach was correct? Were you overly optimistic when you wrote that book?
So it's a great question, and let me answer in two parts. The first is that you're right. I wrote that book in the 1990s. It was based on a lot of research that occurred in Shanghai and throughout China in 1992, 93, 94. And I studied a lot of aspects of the intersection of foreign businesses interacting with Chinese companies, and looked at what the impact was there for Chinese citizens and for Chinese workers. One of the major findings of that book, and it was based on some pretty systematic research and a study that was based on 81 factories in the Shanghai area, I was able to show that having associations with foreign firms ultimately created a different kind of labor regime and a different kind of engagement with the international norms that we think of about human rights and labor rights, and that it was a positive thing. And so to me, the engagement policy should be unquestioned. It was clear that the more engagement that occurred with China, the more social, political, and ultimately economic transformation, of course, would change. I was a big advocate for that in the 1990s. I was part of the coalition of people that argued for China's entry into China's permanent normal trade relations with the United States and its entry into the WTO. And I really believed in that model. Now, to the first part of your question, did I overestimate that? I did. I think one of the things that we didn't account for at that time, or at least I didn't, was just what a different leader might mean. And, you know, if you look at the trajectory of leaders from Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and then to Xi Jinping, President Xi is a very different kind of leader, and he had a very different set of ideas about what should happen and where China should go. Now, the second half of that question, I will have to say I continue to believe in engagement. Even if we overestimated what the engagement policies might mean for Chinese citizens, tough on China policies and sort of delinking things the way they happened under the previous administration, and President Trump's tough on China talks and Peter Navarro's tough on China negotiation tactics, I don't think they help anybody. And I think in some ways they continue to delink the US from China and continue to push away from the norms of the West influencing. But we are in this new era in which we have President Xi, who has already shifted towards delinking from the United States. And then we had that exacerbated by the previous president. And so my hope is that President Biden will continue down an engagement path. I'm very unhappy with the comments of people like Kurt Campbell, who are saying this isn't, the engagement policy is over, we're in competition now. I don't think that's constructive for anybody. And so I think that you only influence through engagement.
Next, I wanted to zoom in onto this specific company, Apple, which you had lots of experience with. As you told us, in 2014, you were hired by Apple to help the firm navigate China, basically. And one of your research projects was to study Apple's supply chain vulnerabilities. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your findings of that research. When you shared your findings with Apple leadership, what was their response?
Well, so a couple of key things. First of all, just remember, Apple entered China in 2001, which was the same year that China's accession to the WTO happened. And so that was a period where those of us who were consulting for foreign companies, we saw sort of the doors flung open and, the supply chain and the markets were open for business. And, that was a very good time for foreign companies in China. China was no longer allowed to have what we would call a quid pro quo for market access. So they couldn't force you to have a joint venture if you wanted access to the supply chain or access to the internal markets. And so, a lot of companies just did very well under that time period, and Apple was among them. And so just watching that trajectory evolve over the next decade, it was very interesting to see companies like Apple and Samsung and Ericsson and many other companies just really have an open time to really manage the supply chain as they saw fit and have access to the internal markets. And it was good for China and it was good for foreign companies. Now, the interesting thing that happened was this transition with Xi Jinping. And I think some in the China field saw it coming. I'm not so sure that I did, and nobody realized how serious the turn would be. And so what happened during this time was, Xi Jinping was elected in the fall of 2012, and he was inaugurated in March of 2013. And suddenly the tone was very, very different. And so when I came to Apple, it was about a year after that, but I was immediately having an uncertain feeling of what's going to happen here for companies like Apple that are so deeply embedded in the supply chain here. And so I started doing my standard leadership development teaching, but I also started doing research on Apple's situation in the supply chain. And I was concerned because Apple was so deeply embedded in the supply chain in China, and it was so much part of their economic and business model. And so what that meant was, as the government started to put more and more pressure on foreign companies that were big, valuable foreign companies like Apple to do what they wanted them to do, whether that was some version of technology transfer or some version of setting up R&D centers or data centers or whatever it was going to be very hard for companies to resist. And so I started talking to people in the company around that. And, these executives at places like Apple, they're all very smart. They've done a lot of research, but, they're not political scientists. And so they don't sort of think carefully about like what's happening with the current political environment and how are these things changing. And so initially when I was talking to people, I was getting rebuffed a little bit. But eventually some of the things that I was predicting started to come true. And so people started listening more.
As you mentioned, the rivalry between China and the United States is sort of escalating across many fronts, really, not only economically, but also politically and in many tech sectors. So, if China views its own model as ascendant, the United States' power and influence is waning, how should U.S. companies operating in China navigate the tricky political headwinds?
So here I would say there are three parts to the answer to your question. The first is, of course, there's just still the economics of this issue. China's market is the largest market in the world. And so, if you look at companies like Apple or Tesla, they're partly in China because China is the second largest market for both of those major global companies. And so, being a part of the market and being a part of that system is really important to a lot of companies. Secondly, it's also really important to be a part of that supply chain. China's manufacturing supply chain it's comparable to none in the world. It is the most powerful and efficient manufacturing supply chain by far. And, there are multiple reasons for that. It has to do with the floating population, the infrastructure. It has to do with the integrated nature of the movement of labor and the infrastructure aspects. And so it's just a very powerful supply chain that you can't replicate. You can't just tell a company like Apple or Tesla, like, well, just move to India and it'll be fine. Like it doesn't work like that. And so it's just a very powerful system if you take the market and the supply chain. But there's a third thing that is more the answer to your question, like what do companies do with that? And in my view, of course, companies have to think about what their moral standing on certain issues are, whether they're human rights or, any of the issues that are floating around in China today. But the real key to balance in China is to understand the dance between the central government and the localities. So we often think of China as this one-party authoritarian system that comes out of Beijing. And the plans are all set by President Xi in Beijing and the State Council. But China has been so successful in the economic development process because of the localities and the entrepreneurial behavior of the localities. Mm-hmm. And so, my advice to every foreign company that's dealing in China is, yes, it's important to understand what Beijing wants and what the major provinces and municipalities want. But you also have to have local engagement with not just the municipal governments that you're involved with, but also the district governments. And you have to build that engagement because that's the sort of secret sauce for China's economic development process is the entrepreneurial behavior of local municipalities and districts. And they're building industrial clusters like we've not seen in the world before. And so my advice to companies is always to think carefully about what your moral and ethical standards are, but then to think very carefully about big ticket political issues, but also local government political issues.
In addition to company behavior, I also wanted to talk a little bit about what role government can potentially play here. So in your opinion, how should government policies respond to China's rise as a superpower? And we saw the Senate bill, humongous bill, passed only a couple of days ago, a few weeks ago. Do you see the Senate bill as heading in the right direction, or do you think it's sufficient or not?
So let me answer a couple of different aspects. I'll first speak to the Senate bill, but I'll just try to wrap it into a couple of other issues. I don't love the Senate bill approach. I mean, look, if the US Senate wants to invest money in the building of technology in the US tech sector, that's great. They should do that. That should be part of infrastructure and should be part of development. And by the way, part of the reason the US became such a powerful economy was because in the middle part of the 20th century, there was a tremendous amount of government investment in supporting industries. So think about automobiles. The reason the automobile industry in the United States became so powerful was because the United States invested in infrastructure and building of roads. Think about Silicon Valley. We often think of Silicon Valley as the heart of entrepreneurialism. The internet wouldn't exist without the government's investment in DARPANET. And so like this idea that came out in the 1980s under Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan, that we should just like leave it to the market to handle all these things, I think is just ridiculous. Like it's just not the way that development happens. That being said, so if the Senate wants to pass a bill saying it's investing in high-tech development, I love it. That's great. It should not have anything to do with China. This should not be talked about as a competition with China, because what should happen is the US should be investing in these areas, and we should have over the last 40 years the way China was, and like just leave it at that. Like we can still have an engagement policy and not be thinking about this as a competition between who's investing more, China or the United States, in their high-tech sectors. So that's the first thing. The second thing to your question is, this is not just about the Senate bill. This is about other things like Kurt Campbell's proclamation that we are no longer in an engagement regime, we're in a competition regime. Personally, I don't understand the point of that. Like that just seems ridiculous to me. Like, yes, we are competitors with China. Yes, we are the two largest economies in the world. Yeah, but why talk about abandoning engagement? I think that this is just incendiary language and incendiary behavior. And the third piece that is a different topic somewhat, but is sort of related to the Senate bill and, Kurt Campbell's statement. I am so disappointed that the United States sent 3 senators over to Taiwan on a military jet to talk about the announcement of vaccine donations. Like it's just bad behavior. It's incendiary behavior. It's not the kind of thing that's going to be productive for pushing forward an engagement approach to US-China relations. And so Senate bill is fine, but why we're talking about it as competition with China, I don't understand.
I see. And final question of the day, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of a tech alliance between, like-minded democracies, so to speak. As you know, the US-EU Tech Alliance, or more accurately, Trade and Technology Council, was unveiled following talks between the EU Commissioner and President Biden. And according to a press statement, the group will seek to set common standards for new technologies such as AI. So do you see the possibility of the world potentially decoupling into separate tech spheres across ideological fault lines? And do you see a new Sputnik movement coming? And if so, what it will be like?
Wow, that's a great question and a great framing of the question. The short answer is that yes, I believe the world is going to cleave in two. I think this has been on the move for longer than I realized it was. I mean, I thought Xi Jinping was sort of the moving point or the fulcrum moment. Actually, this probably goes back as far as 2008 when China announced the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's kind of clear if you look at what they're doing with BRI now that they're very, very focused on dividing the world in two. And so, I was talking to a tech executive not too long ago, and this issue was coming up, and this person said, well, maybe we'll forget about China because, that's only 1.4 billion people and we can do what we do in social media with the rest of the world. And, my answer was, do you understand what the Belt and Road Initiative is going to do? Like, this isn't going to just be about the US versus China. This is going to be about China and the leading of the global South and kind of dividing the world up. And so, yes, I actually think if you look at infrastructure development, if you look at 5G and Huawei's role in places like Southeast Asia and Africa and the Middle East, like these are issues that are going to play significant roles. Now, it's very interesting to me when a couple of months ago, China signed this deal with the EU. It looked to me like, wow, okay, this is really going to be the key turning point. Like, is the EU going to go with China and what's most efficient, or is there going to be a sort of rebuilding of the NATO alliance? it looks to me like President Biden is really trying to rebuild that alliance and really going to try to make sure that, Western Europe goes the direction that the U.S. is going to go, and China will do what it's going to do. So to your question, I actually am very much anticipating a division in the world that is going to in some ways divide the world into based loosely on ideological lines, but more importantly, it's going to be based on U.S. leadership versus Chinese leadership.
And thank you so much for all the insights, Professor Guthrie. This has been such a great conversation. And we'll make sure to include the links to your books in the show notes section so our interested audience can take a further look. But thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, you too.
Thank
Enjoyed
you.
it.
Bye.